Okay, good evening, everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started here. We might have a few others join us as we go along, but that's okay. I know it's really hard to hit up a webinar when the sun's shining and we have such few good days outside. So we really appreciate you being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy. She's going to get us started, go through some housekeeping things, and then we will kick off our seminar on soil sampling.
Okay, so I think at this point everybody can see my screen. I'm going to go ahead and share the presentation. Okay, does that look good, Caitlin? Super. All right, well, welcome everybody. I just want to introduce you to a couple of housekeeping things on your Zoom interface that you are now a part of. So you have come in muted with your video off. If at some point you would like to ask a question, there is an unmute button at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you toggle your mouse over, a banner will highlight, and then you can go ahead and click that option. When we take breaks in the middle and at the end of the presentation, we'll ask for audio questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please feel free to pop it in the chat box. So that's a little talkie bubble that is in the center of your panel when you scroll over it at the bottom of your screen. You can type in a question in there at any time, and Caitlin and I will answer them as we go along. So that should be pretty much it for Zoom. Without further ado, tonight's presentation is a cooperation between Cornell Small Farms FarmOps program and the Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops program, of which Caitlin and I are both members. This event wouldn't be made possible without the financial support and sponsorship of FarmOps, and we're really, really happy to be partnering with them for this project, as well as other presentations in this series. So the Cornell Cooperative Extension Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops program is a program that works with the 5 county associations in Southwest New York to bring research-based programming to folks like you. And while normally we work in the Southwest region of New York, for this particular partnership, we are working across the state. This is our little disclaimer here. We're not going to provide any veterinary advice or financial counsel or anything to that nature. But in general, with our presentations, we are doing our best to provide you the most science-based information that we can. Everything is as up to date as we know, and everything is as accurate as we know. But please know, if you do need very specific advice, we recommend that you go to a professional for that information. Okay, so tonight we have 2 presenters, Caitlin and myself. Caitlin, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. So hi, I'm Caitlin Wally-Stoll. I'm our team's farm business management specialist and team leader. So I focus on kind of the paperwork of farming. So I always say people, paperwork, and hopefully a profit at the end of the day. Just a little bit of background. I have been within Cooperative Extension for about 10 years now, and work with a variety of different farmers, now focusing on dairy, livestock, and field crops. I also have my own kind of diversified livestock farm, so have firsthand experience of soil sampling from a very young age, which, you know, now we have 4-wheelers and Kubotas to get around large fields. And before, I remember doing a lot of walking with a very big pail of dirt. So thanks, Amy. I'll turn it over to you.
Yep. Thanks, Caitlin. So my name is Amy Barkley. I'm the livestock and beginning farm specialist with our team. So I work with beginning farmer support. So if you're going to start a farm and you don't know where to start, come to me and I'll help direct you where to go. I also work with everything livestock and poultry. So basically anything that doesn't produce milk. If it produces milk, I'll share that responsibility with our dairy specialist. I work with grazing. I work with product quality and consistency, and the general management of all the livestock species. I have a small farm in Southwest Erie County, and it's been a whole lot of fun. We have a diversified operation. We do heritage poultry, orchard, and market garden apiary. So a whole little bit of everything just to keep things exciting. So tonight's presentation is about soil sampling for success. And to borrow one of Caitlin's phrases, you don't know what you don't measure. So essentially tonight is us showing you how to measure the nutrition of your soil in order to get information back to allow you to make evidence-based decisions on how to best manage your soil so that things will grow the best that they can. In tonight's agenda, we'll start with how or why we test soil. So I gave a little bit of the why, but we'll go a little bit further into depth there. Then we'll go into how to take soil samples, how to fill out those darn submission forms, which seems super complicated, but I promise you, Caitlin will walk you through. They're not so bad. We'll introduce you to a program called the Web Soil Survey. This program is vital if your soil testing laboratory asks you for a soil type. And it's also good to know how to navigate in order to get your soil types. We'll talk about interpreting soil test results and then some financial considerations that you can keep in mind when you get your reports back. Okay, so we have your first poll. So if you could please tell us who you are, you can select multiple. So we have here your commercial farmer and I've sampled soil. I'm a gardener or homesteader and I've sampled soil. I'm new to soil sampling, which is perfectly fine. Thanks for being here. And I never plan on growing anything. I don't see the rest of that, but I assume it says I'm in the wrong class.
Yes, yeah, it cuts it off, but I don't plan on growing anything and I'm in the wrong seminar. And then if you click, there is one other question that asks what you're planning on planting and growing or what you're currently planting and growing. And this just helps us get a better idea of who all of you are.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like we've got a good chunk. So we're going to go ahead and end this. We'll share the results. And you can see we've got a good mix of folks. So most of you are new to sampling, which is great because you're our target audience for this. And if you've already sampled before, we hope you can pick up some new tips or tricks along the way. And then it looks like we've got a good mix of folks, with the majority being vegetables, but lots of others crops here as well.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Okay. So the why do we test soil? So testing soil allows us to see what we can't see with our naked eye, which is soil nutrition. There are soil aggregate particles that we can see. There's pore spaces where water and air can accumulate that we can see. But just because the soil looks fluffy, just because the soil looks dark, just because the soil is rocky or clay, doesn't necessarily influence what the baseline nutrition of that soil is. And we don't know that unless we go ahead and test it. Farm history could play into this, or parcel history. Maybe if soil was brought in, or if that parcel was tilled for a long time, if it was in pasture for a long time, these can all influence that baseline soil nutrition. From this information, we can find out how much of a nutrient that we need to amend the soil in order to grow the crops we want. So for instance, something like corn is what we consider a heavy feeder. So it takes up a lot of nutrients, and the baseline soil is going to influence how much nutrition we put on that soil to make that corn grow optimally. Yeah, you can grow corn in any soil, but you'll get a little stubby plant or maybe a really leggy plant that isn't very green if the nutrition of the soil is off. And that's just an example. And the final reason we test soil, and this is the final of this list, there are multiple other reasons, but one of the things that we see in our region is that sometimes there are soils that have been contaminated either by factories putting pollutants out, or perhaps the soils are maybe the soils are brought in from a location and you're not sure what their origin is, or perhaps you're in a city or suburb where you may have some toxic minerals in the soil. And we want to be able to identify those to make sure that they're not taken up by crops such as vegetables that we consume. When we think about the basic soil nutrients, you've probably heard of NPK before, and that is short for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are our three heavy hitter nutrients. When we test soil, those are typically the ones that we fertilize too. You'll see on the report form when Caitlin goes over it that there are some other nutrients that are reported, but generally speaking, these are your top three that you want to focus on. They're the most vital to plant health and well-being. Interestingly though, you can have the right amount of nutrients in your soil, but your pH might be off. pH is, let's see if I talk about it. I don't talk about it, so I'll talk about it now. So soil pH is essentially a measure of the buffering capacity of a soil. So how acidic or basic it is. And based on where that soil falls in the spectrum, that influences nutrient availability. So this fun slide. I'm going to walk you through kind of how this is structured. So what we have here is on the top portion from left to right, we see a low pH, strongly acidic soil, all the way to a high pH or a strongly alkaline soil. Generally speaking, when we look at the bottom of the chart, we can see a pH scale. So so a 1 would be like vinegar, for instance. 4 is not something that'll burn you, but it's acidic to a plant. So we go here from 4 to 10. 7 is neutral. So 7 is like our drinking water. And when we are looking at soil nutrition, we want to fall somewhere between a 6.5 and 7 or so. Now, what I want to put your attention to is the nitrogen bar. And all of these bars are going to read similarly. But how this works is that the colorful part of the bar is how available that nutrient is to the plant in the different pH range. So for nitrogen, for instance, if we follow, let me see if I can put on a red laser. There we are. So with nitrogen, we see that it kicks in and it has high availability around a 6, and it starts slacking off around 7.75. So green is good, yellow is warning, you probably need to add more nutrients or change your pH a little bit. And then red is that nutrient is not very well available. When we look down this chart, we can see that most of the nutrients are going to be in the green category around 6.5 to a 7 or so. And this is why we target this for soil pH. That said, different crops require different pH soils, and different crops do differently in different pH soils. So you don't necessarily have to have a 6.5 or a 7 to be successful. Though that said, many of the soils in Western New York, for instance, are really low. They're somewhere around a 5. And so we might want to do something like adding lime to increase the pH of that soil to make it more amenable to soil nutrition. So that soil is able to allow the plants to soak up those nutrients better. Okay, so we're going to walk through soil sampling technique, but this is kind of the introduction to that. There are 3 different main methods of taking a soil sample. We can use a soil probe, which is a pointed device that is purposefully designed for sampling soil. We can use a soil auger, which is a very similar type device. Or we can just use a garden shovel. Garden shovel's cheap, it's available, and you can get a pretty good sample from a spade. When we sample into the soil, we need to sample at the depth that the roots of the plants that we're looking at go. So generally speaking, for pasture, that's around 4 to 6 inches. And we also consider that depth for no-till gardens or fields, except for surface sampling in no-till gardens, which is 1 inch. So with no-till situations, we'll sample the first inch, and then we'll sample down a 4 to 6 inch sample as well. That's because in a no-till situation, we are constantly applying nutrients to the top of the soil, and they're soaking in with the rain or with the movement of things like bugs and worms to the soil profile. And we want to make sure that the nutrients that we're applying are actually making it down into the soil. Because if we go off nutrient recommendations alone and we add over many years, we might not be building the soil nutrition as much as we think we are. That's why we do those 2 samples. In a typical field where you're mold board plowing, so you're taking a plow, moving the soil, flipping it over, you want to sample to the depth of the plow base. And that's because that plow is tipping the soil, the bottom of that depth of soil, and tipping it on its head. So we want to make sure we sample through that entire soil profile to get an accurate representation of what's down there in terms of nutrition. Now for orchards, we're going to sample about 8 to 14 inches down. Tree roots generally go a little deeper than that, but 8 to 14 inches is going to encompass most of the root mass of those plants, which is why we go that depth. When we test a field or an area that we want to plant, it's best to keep those areas below 10 or 15 acres in total, just because as you get bigger, your difference in soil from place to place within that field changes more and more. So you can theoretically get a larger discrepancy, which doesn't help you when you're going to apply nutrients according to a nutrient report. So that's why we say 10 or 15 or 20 acres. And then we want to take 10 to 15, 10 to 20, somewhere in that area. I recommend 15 to 20 samples per field at a minimum. The more samples you have, the more accurate your number is going to be out the other end. But it's also time consuming to take soil samples. So based on what time you have available, how big your fields are, how many fields you're testing, that will influence how many samples you take, but don't take less than 10 or your soil sample is not going to give you the information that you need. When we think about sampling spots within a field, we want to do it randomly. We want to encompass that whole area so that we can get the best idea of what's out there. So when we look at these diagrams at the bottom of the page, I'm going to go from left to right. So we'll start with 2A. This is a good sampling pattern. It's a randomized sampling pattern. That'll work for any field or garden box or what have you that you're testing. 2B is a diagonal pattern. This is a little less accurate, but still okay. And then when we go to 2C, so this example shows you're taking, a number of samples, but they're all in a 10-foot radius. This is not going to tell you a whole lot of information, as is a sample that goes straight down the line of a field. And it's just recommended that the more random the sample you can get, the better off you are. So here's an example of a soil testing pattern. This is a field that has an eroded spot in the upper left. In the lower right, it has a low spot. And then it's got a general planting area in the middle. So when you're taking samples from this field, you're not going to want to plant in anything that is, you're not going to want to sample anything that's vastly different than the rest of the field. So if you've got a little swampy spot, if you've got an area where livestock have been congregating around a water for years and years and years, if you've been planting the same crop in one area for multiple years in a row, but have been rotating them in other areas, like these are reasons why you would maybe not want to take samples there and take samples randomized across the rest of the field. If you really want to plant in that area that's unique, go ahead and sample that separately and send that separate sample in, because chances are that soil is going to have a different nutritional profile than the rest of the field in general, or it's going to skew your average of the majority of the field. So go ahead and take those samples separately. If you have multiple fields and they're split, with a physical barrier, maybe it's a road, maybe it's a fence, maybe it's a rock wall if you're in southeastern New York, you're going to want to go ahead and split those fields out because those fields can have differences in management, prior management to you taking over, or maybe you manage them differently, location, obviously, and what species have been growing in that field prior to you working it and testing it. We talked about avoiding abnormalities, upland versus bottomland. And another thing is old ag land versus newly cleared land. So just say you have a pasture and you want to expand it because you want to grow corn as a row crop. And so you clear out 50 feet of the wood line and you're like, okay, stumps are removed, all's good, I'm going to go plant it now. That soil within that wood line is going to have a vastly different look than the soil that's been in the field for a long time. So go ahead and test those two separately as well. And these are just examples. If you have specific questions on different, should I test this separately? Let us know and we can help you through that. All right, so now we're going to get into the different testing methods in terms of physically taking the sample. So the first is using a shovel. Again, it's very accessible. And generally, when you go ahead and take any soil sample, you first want to go through and remove any organic matter on the surface. So that could be leaf debris, that could be growing grass, that could be corn stover from where corn was harvested and the stover was blown back on the ground. You just want to remove any of the organic material because that's going to throw off your organic material concentration in your soil sample, which is then going to throw off your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium values of your recommended application rates. So just take off the organic matter. It's a lot easier that way. With a shovel, you want to dig a straight-sided hole, and then you'll want to move back and take a slice of soil. So we'll go through this in the video because it's going to make a lot more sense there than me just explaining off a slide. This is a diagram of what the soil slice looks like. We'll talk about this in the video. Using a soil probe is a lot easier, but soil probes are a little harder to come across. Sometimes there are ag service providers or extension offices that loan them out. Maybe your neighbor friend has one that you can go ahead and borrow. but these are pretty easy to use. You just stab it in the soil at a 90-degree angle through the soil surface, lift it out, and you've got a soil sample. Pretty simple. All right, so I'm gonna pop out of this presentation and we're gonna go on to the videos. So we've got 4. We've got 6 here in a row, and we're gonna go through them one by one. Okay. Just gotta move my bar around here because it's blocking my play screen here. Okay, great. So this is the introduction to soil sampling. And let me know if you can hear it okay. When we think about sampling soil, we have a couple of options for tools we can use.
Hey, Amy, you're buffering and the sound isn't coming through.
Oh, it's playing okay at my end. I'm gonna turn off my video and see if that helps. So the video says it's totally buffered. So let's see if this works. When we think about sampling soil, we have a couple of options for tools we can use. We're gonna look at 2 now, and then we'll look at another one in another video. These are common for field sampling because they can take large slices of soil and we can get a sample pretty easily. This is a shovel. I know you didn't need that introduction, but it works just as well as this fancy device, which is a soil probe. The soil probe is a fancier device and is made with the sole intent of sampling soil. You can rent these sometimes from your local cooperative extension office or New Jersey Cooperative Extension Office if you're in New Jersey. You can purchase them online for use, or your farm service provider may have them for you to use when they come out and sample your soil. So this tool is pretty cool. It is just a, whoops. It has a tube here with a sharpened end that'll plunge into the ground. You'll twist it, pull up your soil sample, and then push it out. And then we'll show you how to use the shovel in a moment. But let's take a sample with this guy and see how it goes. When we're taking a sample out in the field, we're going to take 15 or 20 random samples across about a 20-acre area or less. We'll talk about that again in a little bit. But when we go out and sample, especially in a field like this, we want to find an area where there's not a lot of surface organic matter. If you're in a cornfield, for instance, you can sample in between the rows, or if you're in an orchard, you can sample away from where the leaf litter is. But in a grass field like this, you might want to look for patches that have less organic matter on them. So if we look around here, we don't want to take a sample here where there's a clump of grass, but maybe we want to take a sample here where there's just a few pieces of dead grass on the soil surface. It's pretty easy for us to clean. We don't want a surface that has any living organic matter because this will influence how the sample reads. Because we're in a field and we're sampling theoretically in this example for a pasture situation, we're going to take the soil probe and push it down about 6 inches into the soil, straight down. We'll twist it, and then we'll come up with our soil sample. At this point, you can remove any organic matter from the surface. So we'll take this off because this is a little excessive. There's nothing green on there. Then we'll move over here, push it out into our bucket. Whoop. And then repeat that process several times in a random pattern over the course of the field. Now we're going to go ahead and sample with a shovel. This looks a little different because the width of the spade is wider than what we saw with the soil probe, but we can mimic what a soil probe does. And here's how we do that. So we're going to go look for another area in this field. Now let's choose right here where there's not a lot of organic material. And we're going to go ahead and make a slice into the ground with a shovel about 6 inches. And then I'm going to go ahead. This does tear up the soil a little bit, but we need to have an area made so that we can get a slice out. So we're going to take about 1.5 inch slice or so straight down. We'll come up with that. And there's our soil, but this is not the end of our sample. So in order to get a tube of soil, what we're going to go ahead and do is remove soil from either side of the spade. so that we can sample the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. It might be a little sloppy here because it just rained. And you can be approximate, it doesn't have to be perfect. We'll leave that there though, because that's the middle. Okay. And there is about a 6 to 8 inch core sample of soil that then you can take and add to your bucket. Okay, so at this point, what we'll do is we're going to jump into soil sampling in a raised bed and in a garden. So this looks a little bit different than.
Hi there, everyone. My name is Amy.
Whoa,
and I am
hello.
a livestock and beginning farm specialist.
Sorry about that.
Southwest New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops Program. And today,
Where's that
we're
playing
gonna
from,
talk about
Caitlin?
preparing poultry.
It looks like the
As we
tab
all
that's
know,
the
winters
farthest
in
left.
Southwest New York can be absolutely brutal.
There you go.
We've
That
got
one.
Ah, chicken video.
Yep.
I had to go rogue. Sorry about that. All right. So as I was saying, before I rudely interrupted myself, so we're going to go into gardens and raised beds. The sampling procedure is going to be about the same, but it's on a smaller scale. So Caitlin's going to demonstrate this with a handy dandy garden trowel.
Now we're going to show you how to take a soil sample using something like a garden trowel. The advantage of this is that it's a lot smaller and easier to maneuver. So when you're sampling something like a raised bed or a garden, it just makes it a quicker process. The idea is still the same. So we're looking to get that soil profile. And still similarly, we're going to get multiple subsamples from around the area that we're testing. One thing that I do want to note before we get started, as you can see here, we've got several different raised beds. In this situation, you could do one of two things. You could run a sample for each bed separately, or if each bed was made using the same soil, you could sample all of them together in one sample, just getting a few different kind of subsamples. Hey, Amy, I just lost the video sound. Soil probe.
Okay. It's buffered.
Thing that I do want to note before we get
Do you hear that now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay.
Started. As you can see here, we've got several different raised beds. In this situation, you could do one of two things. You could run a sample for each bed separately, or if each bed was made using the same soil, you could sample all of them together in one sample, just getting a few different kind of subsamples from each spot. So to take a sample from a raised bed or a small garden using a garden trowel, what we're going to do is come over soil. And very similarly to when we used our shovel in the soil probe, we're looking to get the full profile of that soil 6 to 8 inches deep. So I'm just going to take my trowel, stick it straight down, pick it back up. And if you want to come in a little bit closer, I'll show you what it looks like once we pick it out. So in order to make sure we're getting that profile, same thing we did with the shovel earlier, I'm going to stick it down on the other side. So then I got a nice kind of tube of soil here and pick it straight up. And from here, we've got soil from the very top all the way down to the bottom. This is a clean bed, so there's no vegetative matter on the top that we're trying to get rid of. So all I'm going to do is kind of separate out the sides here. And then this is what I'm going to put in our bucket for us to get our big sample overall.
When we think about, okay, so that was how to sample in a raised bed. And
Amy,
yes,
before you do this one, do you want to stop your share and then
yeah,
reshare and do the optimize for video share sound thing? I think that might help.
Okay, let's try that. Sorry about that, guys. I feel so bad.
That's okay. And we'll figure it out.
Yeah. Sometimes sound isn't ideal, but hopefully this will work this time. So, oh, these appear to be the same video. That's fun. Okay, so this video is, Caitlin, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the 1 inch soil sampling?
This is soil sampling in a garden.
Okay, perfect. All right, so without further ado, we'll go ahead and play this. Hopefully the sound quality comes through a little better this time.
Now we're going to look at taking a sample in a garden type area. So we've looked at fields, raised beds. Garden is the same exact process. You can use either a small shovel, a trowel, a soil probe, or even a large shovel. So this soil is a little bit more compact than the raised beds we were looking at, but again, it's still the same process. So what I'll do to take my sample here is, if I'm using the trowel, stick this straight down. And if you want to come in a little bit closer, we're gonna stick it straight down on the other side and kind of lift that up. So you'll see we've got the top layer of soil down about 5-6 inches. We want this whole profile, but we don't need this much. So I'll kind of clean off that side, clean off this side. And then this way I'm still preserving the entire profile, but we don't need all of that soil. So this is what I'll add into our bucket. In this area, I'd probably take between 10 and 20 different samples from different locations across the garden to try to get that representative sample that we'll talk about here.
Okay. And so finally, once we have gone through in our fields or in our raised beds or in our gardens and taken all of the samples that we need for that area, we're going to do something called aggregating the sample. And this is where we mix it all together and get it ready to ship out in the mail.
Now we're going to show you how to prepare your sample for sending it into the lab. So in any type of sample, whether it was the raised beds or the garden or the fields or the pasture, we collected several smaller samples called subsamples. In order to get a representative sample of the entire area that we're trying to test, we have to aggregate all of those subsamples that we took. So we told you to put the soil into the bucket, and now we're going to show you what you do with all of that soil that you put in the bucket. So I've got my bucket of kind of those subsamples or the multiple samples, but from the same area that we're testing. In this bucket, there's between 10 and 20 or even 30 subsamples, depending on how big of an area we're testing originally. So what I'm going to do is aggregate these samples to try to get one representative sample for the entire area. We do this through a process of homogenization. Basically, we're just mixing everything together. So gloves are good for this step, or if you don't mind the dirt, you can just use your hands. We're going to mix this up as well as we can. Now in southwestern New York, where we have a lot of clay fields, you'll find these really big clumps of soil. It's super important to make sure you're breaking those up so that you get a really good mixture in your sample. If you come across any sod clumps, you can get rid of those. If you find any worms, you can return them back to their home. And we're just going to keep mixing. We're going to mix this as well as we can. And usually it takes a couple of minutes. And again, any of these clumps that we find, we're going to make sure we're breaking those up. So once we've got the sample all mixed together, we're going to spread it out on either a piece of newspaper or a paper towel in a place where it can dry, obviously not outside in the mist where we are today. And we're going to try to dry the sample down a little bit. The reason for drying it out is that it helps to preserve the soil, and it also saves on shipping costs. So what I normally do is when it's a sunny day, I'll just use kind of the outdoor picnic table, put a layer of paper towels or newspaper or paper bags down, and spread this soil out in an even layer. You don't have to use all of it because we mix this together really well. I probably use a little bit more than I need to, especially when the soil's wet, because then once this dries down, I'll mix it together even more. So once I've got this kind of spread out, I'll again make sure that any of these big clumps are broken up, and I'll leave it to sit overnight or for a couple of hours so that it dries down. Now, if we pretended that this was already dry, what I would do is kind of put this all back together, give it a good mix one more time, and then from this homogenized or aggregated mixture, we only need between 1 and 2 cups. So that's why it's really important to make sure you're getting a lot of subsamples that are representative of the entire area and that you're mixing it together really, really well. So I would take these 1 to 2 cups, put them into a sandwich bag and clearly label it, and then that's what we're going to send into the lab. Some crops, especially woody perennials, things like...
So before I jump into this, I should give this a little bit of an introduction. So we're going to shift back to a little bit of soil sampling again. And for some crops like blueberries, we need to take, and no-till crops. So remember I discussed no-till, we need to take a 1 inch and a 4 to 6 inch as well. We're going to discuss a little bit of the why and how to take that surface sample.
Like blueberries or trees require a different type of soil sampling. So in this situation, we're actually going to collect 2 samples for one crop. We take a surface level sample that's 1 to 2 inches into the soil, and then a subsurface sample, which is between 2 and 8 inches into the soil. So what we've got here is a crop of blueberries. You'll see that the crop has mulch on top, so I'm going to show you kind of how we get underneath that to get the sample. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're sampling where those roots are so that we know what nutrients those roots are getting. So with these blueberries, because they do have a mulch layer, the first thing that we're going to do is clear that off. We're also going to try to get in close to the plant so that we can get to where the roots are or where they're going to be, but we're going to try to not damage those roots too. Okay, so now we've gotten through this mulch layer and we're down to where the soil actually is. So for this process, you'll need 2 buckets, one for this surface sample and one for the subsurface sample. When I take this surface sample, I usually use a trowel just because it's a little bit easier. I'm really only putting this trowel down 1 to 2 inches. I'm going to cut the other side and I'm going to lift this up. And this 1 to 2 inches is what my sample would end up being. So I'm going to remove this mulch because we don't need to worry about testing that. I'm going to take out this wormy and put him back in his home. And there would be kind of our surface sample. I would put this into a bucket that have clearly labeled surface so that I can keep those separate. So now I need to get to that subsurface sample. I'm going to use the same hole because I've already cleared off those top 2 inches. I'm going to stick my trowel down even farther. And I'm going to spin it around a little bit, pick it straight up. And you'll see how the soil's kind of changed because I've gotten even farther down. So we've got our kind of still what's left of that top layer of topsoil and then down a little bit farther. So this probably went down approximately 6 to 8 inches. This would be considered our subsurface sample. So we would put that in a bucket that's labeled subsurface. So for products like blueberries where we already have them planted, I would probably go around and sample a handful near the bushes where they're already growing. But if it's a new crop of blueberries or like a tree that you're getting ready to plant, it's a little bit easier because there's nothing that you're trying to work around to sample. So again, we're going to take the surface sample and the subsurface sample and make sure we keep those separate, and we'll show you how to fill out that paperwork in just a minute.
Okay, so I'm going to pop my video back on and I'm going to stop my share and reshare. Okay, great. So actually, I will stop at this point. I see that there's a lot of bubbles in the chat.
Yeah.
Can we go ahead and answer some of those? If those
Yes. I think that'll be good. Let's take a breath and we can kind of work our way through all of these. Just give me 1 second because I'm having some screen issues on my side, but we're gonna figure them out.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I could go ahead and read them if you don't have them up.
It's okay, we got them now.
Okay.
So Rebecca shared a really good question that I wanted to wait and talk about it together as a group so we all could kind of learn from it. So I'm going to read what she wrote. We're just getting started and are really interested in not spending more than we need to, all of us, in order to wrap our brains around what we have to work with. We have a field that has been in corn, another that's been in soybeans, and lots that have just been hayed for years and years. We moved here from Arizona, where soil sampling data was very accessible and free, and are suffering a bit of sticker shock. So that's definitely fair, Rebecca. And I think I'll let Amy address this too, but just like one thing that I'll add in here. Later on, we're going to show you the web soil survey, and that's entirely free, and it does provide you with some really good information on your inherent soil type. So when we're talking about soil sampling, it's going to be more important for crops or for fields that have already been cropped, because that's going to show us, we know what the inherent soil type is and what those characteristics are. But with a soil sample, we can see what exactly that particular spot or that particular field has. and what those nutrient requirements are. So Amy, if you want to talk a little bit about how do you make that decision, right? Like what do you sample and what don't you sample?
Yeah. So what I would say is, if you're just starting out, I would put your highest dollar value crops, first in line to be soil tested. So, and those that take a lot of nutrition. So, if you're going to put an orchard in or a blueberry patch, which is a really large investment of both time and money, I would definitely get that soil tested before you put trees or bushes in the ground, because once they're there, it's really hard to amend that soil down in the root zone to allow those plants to flourish. So that would be, my first priority. If you're not growing either of those, my first priority would be those plants which are heavy feeders. So things like corn, for instance, they take up just a lot of nutrients. That's just how they are. And if a field's been cropped over multiple times, you don't necessarily know what the fertilization schedule was for that farm. You don't know your organic matter, which can actually contribute free nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium back into your soil test results. So you don't have to add that much more fertilizer, later on. So when we think about the sticker shock, and there is a sticker shock, the soil samples are somewhere around $20, $25 per sample to send in, not including shipping, to get them tested. But it can, depending on the size of the field, it can save you thousands and thousands of dollars in fertilizer. So it's a large investment up front to get that soil tested, but the returns can be massive. If you're in our region and you want to walk through like some of the pros and cons of, testing versus non-testing with a very specific situation, let us know and we can walk you through that. We can also walk you through how organic matter, for instance, contributes to dollar value, so that, hey, I am getting my money's worth out of this. We'll show that to you if you'd like.
Yeah. Great question, Rebecca. I know can be a really difficult decision. So, good. So we had another question from Sarah. Is there an average size to sample? So for example, would you break down a 50-acre or more field into sections, or would you lump it into one sample, assuming the field was fairly similar, not lows and trenches? Yeah, I mean, I'll go first because I'm the numbers person, and then Amy can go because she's the quality control here. And from my perspective, if the field is similar, right? So just like you were saying, then we kind of use the one sample for 20 acres as a benchmark, a rule of thumb. But if you're planting kind of a lower value crop or something that is an annual, so it's only 1 year, and the field's very similar across 50 acres from an economic perspective, just do one sample for that whole 50 acres. So now I'll let Amy talk.
Well, no, I 100% agree with her.
Perfect.
If that was my scenario, I would 100% not break that field down. It's not worth it. And another thing that you could do is use the web soil survey to see if there's two different soil types in that field that are pretty evenly dispersed. And if they are, you could say, oh, well, this is more of a clay loam, this is more of a gravel loam, I'll test them separately and then fertilize them separately. You could also do that. But if everything looks the same.
Yep. and alternatively too, like if you have a 20-acre field, but half of it's really good and half of it's really bad, then in that case, we would absolutely recommend 2 samples. So It really just depends on, what type of an area you're working with. Greg added a really awesome comment about buffering and how it's a good lesson on rural farmers not having access to high-speed internet. So I'll share this very quick story. I live in the middle of nowhere and we don't have access to any internet or just barely cell phone service. So my wonderful team, Amy included, had to deal with me not having internet all during the pandemic. And I think that that's a really good point that, areas that don't have internet access, we definitely see farmers struggling to get connected with technology that relies on that and access seminars. So if you are having any issues with internet connectivity, please connect with me or Amy, and we will make sure we get you paper copies if you need those. Like I said, we'll send out the actual YouTube video links too, so you can watch them in full quality wherever you're able to get connected. So thank you.
This whole presentation is recorded too. So we'll also send that out.
And then there was a question too about, I think it was back up here and I skipped over it already. Soil sampling and how pH might change over time in using no-till methods. So I kind of just chimed in, and Amy, please add that, you know, in general, I don't know of any specific research studies, but we could find some anecdotal data, and including the small farms program. They've got some fields and farming methods that they're using that we could kind of tap into. But in general, if you're not amending that soil, so if you're not adding lime, adding fertilizer, planting really high demand crops like corn, which is just going to suck everything out, that soil is going to return back to its natural state over time. So for example, in Southwest New York, where our soils are a little bit more acidic over time, our soils decrease in pH if you kind of leave them to their own devices. But as far as like specific no-till methods, in general, you know, we don't have a good data set, but we know that soil wants to return back to what its natural state is. Yep. Amy, any other?
Well, I was just gonna say, if you know, if there's been a lime application recently, that is also going to change the soil slowly over time. So depending on what type of lime was added, it might be a fast release lime or a slow release lime. It might change your pH over the course of multiple years. So that's just something else to consider. So just say you purchased a new farm or a new homestead, and you know, you can get the information as to whether or not somebody limed that parcel of land prior to you taking it over. You might, you know, maybe you take a sample this year, maybe you take one next year, instead of the sampling scheme that we'll talk about later to compare. Okay, so the pH went up this year. There is lime in that soil. It is activating.
Right.
So that's another way that it could change.
Right. Absolutely. So we had another question. Can you explain the difference in limes, please? And Greg, I think we'll touch on it a little bit here, but later on, we're going to talk about interpreting soil samples and what those numbers mean, so we can get a little bit more into it. And I'll also tell you too that we had a colleague that once gave a 2-hour presentation on pretty much this topic. So yes. It can get really complicated really quickly. But in general, there's different kind of quality measures that we look at when determining what type of lime we should use and what type of lime we shouldn't use. And it all goes down to how it's going to interact in the soil and how long it's going to take interacting with the soil. So I know that there was a comment early on about, you know, not buying, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce it right. So help me, Amy, dolomitic lime.
Close enough. Yep.
Yeah. And like, you're going to want to look for specifically an agricultural lime source, or a gardening lime source. And that all comes back to these things that we're going to talk a little bit later about, these quality measures and how it's going to interact with the soil. Because that is a 2-hour long topic, we will also be sharing a really handy dandy fact sheet. Let me just show it to you right now so you know what to look for in your email. This is from our friends on campus, and it's all about liming materials. So it talks about quality parameters. It talks about these measures, CCE and ENB, that we're going to look at when we do our soil sample, as well as different types of liming materials, the pros and cons of each of them: ground limestone, burned limestone, hydrated limestone, and Mars. So that is coming, and we will talk a little bit more, but thank you, Greg, because I know that's always kind of like, well, thank you for telling me my soil needs lime. Now here's my 53 different options. Which one do I pick, right? Yeah. So very good question and very fair question. Mm-hmm. I do have a poll that we can pull up just to kind of touch base with everybody really quick. And this is kind of depending on your situation. Which sampling tool do you think would be the most helpful for you? And you can select more than one.
I personally like tiny shovel.
Oh, me too. If you don't have a tiny shovel, like, that's actually what I use for most of my soil sampling, because it's similar to a trowel, but it works really well in big field situations. So 10 out of 10 recommend my tiny shovel. All right, so got pretty good response. Looks like most people are convinced with the garden trowel. So that's my other kind of handy dandy tool, because it is pretty easy to navigate and get your soil out, but some mixed use here. And soil probe's kind of like the gold standard, but tough to justify the cost on that unless you're doing a lot of soil sampling. So thank you. No heathens that are going to use their bare hands. So
if you did, we wouldn't say no.
That's true. That's true. All right.
Okay. So I'll go head back then and share this guy. Let's see, where are we? All right. So when do we take soil samples? Let's make this big. All right. So spring versus fall, it really doesn't matter, but basically, oh, yeah.
You've got a bar across the top. I wonder if it's like a.
Of course I do.
Yeah.
Better?
Yep, that'll work.
Yeah, I don't think I can make it go away.
Okay, no problem.
Oh, you know what? It's because I'm optimizing my screen. Let's try this again. Thank you for all your patience. Technology is wonderful.
This is probably our 500th Zoom meeting that we've done, and we're still learning all the tips and tricks. So
it is. It's great. It's great.
Thank you.
But we were able to troubleshoot that pretty quick. All right. So when to test, spring versus fall, it really doesn't matter. We want to avoid the spring rains just because it creates really claggy soil, or the fall rains. The soil gets really stuck together, like the video that you saw where I was trying to move it off the shovel and move it out of the soil probe. You could tell it was really sticky. That's really difficult to aggregate. And so we just want to avoid those heavy wet spells. As long as something's not growing on the ground, it's a good time to do a baseline soil test. If there's something growing, that nutrition is going to change over the course of the season. So either before you plant or after you take the crop off are good times to test. If you test in fall, one of the benefits is that you avoid the spring rush to the lab where everybody says, ooh, it's getting nice outside. Ooh, I'm taking the covers off of my raised beds. It's time to test my soil, right? And all of us do that. We all get the gardening bug. We all get the spring bug. And we're like, yes, send the soil sample in today. But realistically, your wait time is going to end up being maybe 2 weeks versus a couple of days. So our recommendation is, if you can, go ahead and test in the fall. And when you're testing year over year, so you can test every 2 to 3 years or so, depending on what crop you're growing, choose to test either in the spring or fall each year, because that's going to influence how that nutrition looks over time. So in terms of testing frequency, so as I think it was Rebecca who brought up, they just moved, they have a new field. We recommend testing prior to use to using a new field or garden bed. And then once that crop is planted, or once you start planting crops, you can then test perennial crops. So those crops that come back year after year, every 3 years. And for annual crops, I have every 2 to 3 here, but sometimes our heavy feeding crops will want to test every year. So, every year before you plant corn, do a test, see how your nutrition application from the previous year influenced your baseline nutrition for the next year. And then as you have a couple of years worth of data under your belt, you can then scale back your testing to every 2 to 3 years, and you'll still get a pretty accurate understanding of how much nutrients you need to add back to the soil each year for that crop. Okay. So we talked about homogenizing the sample already. So we're not going to belabor that. And then, so Caitlin in her video talked about drying the soil on the picnic table, which I think is a fabulous idea, much better than my plan, or what Dairy One, our major soil testing lab in New York State, recommends, which is spreading out the soil into an even layer and then drying it in front of a fan at room temperature for 24 to 72 hours, essentially until that soil changes color and changes consistency and is able to be broken apart pretty well. Word of caution, if you have clay soils, please aggregate your sample prior to drying it. So I did not do this, and this is why my word of caution comes by. So I moved to a new area, tested all my soil. I had 20 core samples, and once they dried out, they stayed as 20 core samples that I could not break apart. I had to pound them with a 3-pound hammer to get them to come apart and homogenize. So the recommendation is, whenever you can, homogenize in the field. When you go ahead and pack that sample and get ready to be sent to the laboratory, it's really important that your labeling is on point. So the labeling on your bag matches your records, labeling on the bag matches what you submit to the laboratory. You'll want to mark that bag with the field ID, date, your farm name, maybe your address or phone number. And then if you're taking, a topsoil sample and a subsoil sample out of the same place, mark it as topsoil or subsoil, just so that the lab is able to put identifying features on your report so that you can interpret it, and so that you know where that soil sample came from, so that you can make management decisions on the appropriate fields. Depending on how you send in the sample, if you get a pre put together sample box from your local cooperative extension office, for instance, or Dairy One, they will send you a 1 cup mailing box or bag, but they recommend on their website 3 cups. So between 1 and 3 cups of mixed dry soil, put it into a Ziploc or a Whirl pack bag. So the bags with the twist down top, something so that the soil sample doesn't fall out of the bag. I'm one of those people that uses cheap Ziploc bags, and so I just double bag it. Then I feel like, okay, if one of them busts in transit, there's a backup. Make sure that bag is closed really well, and then again, keep a list of all the soils that you submit for your records. So with that, we're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break.
Yeah. So I think just one thing to add really quick too, because I just dealt with this with a farm friend. When you take your sample, do not bag it up until you're ready to send it in. So if your soil is not completely dry, which it's impossible to actually get it completely dry. Any type of moisture in there, if it gets heated up or frozen, it's going to change the biology of that soil between your farm and the testing laboratory. So I just had a farmer that thought his soil was dry. It wasn't dry all the way, put it in a bag, threw it on his truck dash, drove around for a couple days before he caught up with me. And so he drops off the sample and you can see it's just wet and soggy and has been heated and reheated over and over again. So take your sample as close to as possible from when you send it out.
Yep. Good call.
So we'll take a 5-minute break. I've got 6:58 right now. So we'll see you back here at 7:03. And we'll dive into the paperwork part of soil sampling, which I know everybody's super excited about. So, and while we're on our break, we do have a poll question, just checking in to see how everybody's doing. There's 3 questions, so go ahead and fill those out at your leisure, and I'll close it in just a couple minutes. So we'll see you back here at 7:03. Okay, so we're gonna start to welcome everybody back to our seminar. While I'm doing that, we do have another poll. We're a big fan of polls in case you haven't been able to figure that out yet, but we have kind of just a for fun poll. If you want to let us know what your favorite color is, and of course there's a farmer tractor twist to that question too. One other housekeeping thing, if you are watching with somebody else at your location, a non-veteran partner or a farm member, please just let us know in the chat. You don't have to share it with everyone. If you don't want to, you can just select only send to hosts so that I can keep our registration list up to date, just so we know how many people are here for reporting. So again, just as you're coming in, we do have kind of a welcome back poll to share your favorite color on the farm. And we'll go ahead and get started here in just a minute as everybody's getting settled back in. For the remainder of tonight, we're going to talk about completing a soil sample submission form, and then kind of working our way through the report that we get back. What do those numbers mean, and what should we be paying attention to? So looks like we've got a good kind of group back. Thank you to everyone who added in. If you have more than one person viewing with you, that's really helpful for our registration. So it looks like we've got a mixed group of folks here. Although, as I'm reading this, my husband is a big Alice Chalmers fan, and by fan I mean fanatic. Like, that's what our mailbox is Alice Chalmers orange with it down to the decal across it, and I left it off of this list. So good thing he's not here. So looks like we've got a good mix though, and I really appreciate everybody who selected anything that runs, because that's how I think most of us are feeling this spring. So let me go ahead here and pull up our presentation. Amy, I just realized that I have the wrong one up, so give me just 1 second here. Almost there.
Of course, when you need them to load fast, they don't, right?
What's that? Yeah, exactly. It's taken its sweet time loading up here. So let's see.
So the documents that we've shared so far will be available in the email that we send out following the presentation. So we'll send the links to the recordings, the links to the individual videos, and the resources links as well. Great question.
Okay, is that showing?
Yep, that looks good.
Gotta switch one of my screens.
Have a good night. Thanks for coming.
Okay, so we're going to talk about filling out a sample submission form and what that process looks like. So specifically, we're going to focus on the Dairy One lab in Ithaca, New York. The reason for this is that this is where most of Cornell Cooperative Extension and Cornell University sends its just run-of-the-mill soil samples. They're really affordable, really accessible, and easy to work with, I find, in my experience. So we are going to focus on their soil sampling forms and their soil sampling method, but with the caveat that for the most part, the sample forms and the reports look pretty similar, or at least tell you the same information. So you can kind of work your way through that from there. So with that being said, there's multiple different soil samples soil sample forms depending on what you're sampling for. So we're going to focus on taking the sample in New York State, since that's where the majority of everyone is here from. And there's different soil testing methods. This basically just means what type of chemistry they're using at the lab to sample. And again, this is a whole nother 2-hour presentation on its own. So we're going to kind of skip past that and focus on nuts and bolts. What form do I actually use? And it really depends on what type of crop you're planning to grow. So for folks that are doing commercial field crops or pasture, you're going to use the first form that we're going to go through. There's a separate form for vegetables, a separate form for fruit, hops, or Christmas trees, a separate form for home gardens, and a separate form for turf. And we'll look at all of them except for turf. So one thing that I do want to mention is that this form that's labeled home garden, don't let it scare you. So for anybody that is growing a market garden in a small area where you might have multiple different crops, I usually recommend using the home garden form. Home garden is used to kind of, most of the time we're not growing one crop in our home garden. So it provides soil sample results that are multiple plant species friendly. So if you have a smaller market garden or a smaller homestead garden, I still would recommend using that home garden form. So we're going to take a look at the form that you would use for a field crop or for a pasture. Amy, is that showing up okay?
Yeah, I can see it.
I'll zoom in a little bit.
Great size.
Perfect. Thank you. So you'll find at the top of all of these forms, it's going to obviously ask for your contact information. Dairy One does a really nice thing where they ask for your contact information as the grower, but then also if you're working with a consultant. So this might be somebody from your seed sales company. It might be, we have Western New York Crop Management Association out here, crop consultants. But then if you're running your sample through a Cornell Cooperative Extension Lab, you can list your local CCE educator or your local regional team field crop specialist or your local vegetable team specialist. So someone besides you is getting those results automatically and is able to look at what you're looking at. So this is an option if you are working through somebody else to send the sample in. Now you can send this sample in yourself. You don't have to go through your local CCE office. Most people tend to go through your CCE office because they will take care of packing it up and shipping it out for you. Sometimes, depending on the office, they'll offer you a little bit of a lower rate than if you were to send it in by yourself. And you also have the option of having somebody else looking at your sample and helping you to navigate that. Not necessary though. So you can, as just a homeowner or as a farmer, you can send your own sample into the Dairy One office. So that's kind of where this billing information comes into play. If you're going through your local office or through some type of an agency, they generally have an account number and they'll just charge you separately for this. Samples can range anywhere from $15 to $50 sample, depending on what you're trying to sample for. The general samples that most of us need run around $20. So that's kind of the administration part of the form, and it'll be the same regardless of what type of a crop you're growing and what type of a form you're using. Now, if you look up here, this is Form A, and it's our soil submission form for commercial field crops. So for this one specifically, the first column that we're going to fill out is bag number. So Amy talked about very clearly labeling all of your bags of soil. If you're sending in more than one sample, then you should label them in chronological order. And up in the corner, really big with a big circle around it, you can put 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And that's the number that you're going to put here in this column. The next column is sample ID. Sample ID is the name or number that you want to use to identify that field. So it could say cornfield, or if you have a lot of fields and you've got them numbered, it could say CN45. My biggest recommendation here is call it a name that you're going to remember 5 years from now. So sometimes we send in samples that might be cornfield, but we have 10 different cornfields or rotating cornfields through, and sometimes it can get a little bit confusing as to which field that actually was. You'll also write this sample ID on that plastic bag that you put your soil in. You're going to write down what date you sampled it, And ideally that sample date is within a few days of when you send this test out. And you're going to write down your soil name, which we'll come back to in just a second. Next, you want to put down tillage depth. So there's a little cheater for tillage depth. Down at the bottom, you'll see what number you put down depends on how far you're tilling that soil. So it's a 1 for no till, a 2 if it's 1 to 7 inches, 3 if you're tilling 7 to 9 inches, and 4 if you're tilling more than 9 inches. If you're doing a no-till field, then what you actually end up doing is having 2 samples. So let's say you're doing a no-till cornfield. Your sample ID might be corn, no-till, surface. And for tillage depth, we're going to put 1. And you might do your second one, corn, no-till, subsurface. And for tillage depth, we're going to put a 1 again. The biggest reason for this is just trying to see if there are any big differences between those 2 samples. How are we going to manage those? Next, you're going to write down if you have any artificial drainage. This is tiling, strategic ditching, and it just kind of shows, if we've got a soil type that is naturally not drained well, but we add artificial drainage, then that's going to affect what our soil nutrient profile looks like. And then you're going to add percent legume last year. So if you're new and you don't know the history of the fields, this can sometimes be a little bit hard to guess, but essentially we break it down into these categories of 0%. So if you're testing a cornfield, then that's 0% legume. 1 to 25%, this is usually if you have like a hay field that is primarily grasses, but there's a little bit of clover growing in it, you could give that a 2. 26 to 50%, I see this a lot if you've got some type of very strategically mixed pasture where it might be 50% grass, 50% clover. And then a 4 if it's 51 to 100%. So if you planted soybeans, for example, in that field last year, you're going to give that a 4. The reason that we look at this column, percent legume per year, is that in the soil results that we're going to look at in a little bit, it actually gives you credit, nitrogen credit, for having legumes growing there. So legumes deposit nitrogen into the soil that future crops can use. The next thing that we fill out is the past 3 years of crops and the planned future 3 years of crops. The reason that we do this is that the results that we look at will actually show us a nutrient management plan 3 years out. And it'll take into account what we're planning to plant. So if you have a field that you're planting corn in for the next 3 years straight, it'll say this is what you have to apply every year for the next 3 years. And we'll show you the crop codes that you use here in just a second. The next column is just if you're doing any type of special soil tests. For the most part, we're just running run-of-the-mill, the standard sample. But if you have anything special, you'll fill that out here. So you fill this line out for each sample that you're taking. It might just be 1 if you're only sampling 1 field. It might be 10 if you're doing, a really intense check-in. They give you a second page if you've run over your first page. And then down here are some supplemental services. So if you want any of these things tested, a nitrate test is something that we use in corn if we need to do a side dress while the corn's growing. For example, you can add these tests on. And then this page are the codes that you can use to fill out this sample. So if you have, for example, corn that you're growing for grain, and you grew that last year and you plan on growing it there for the next 2 years, you're going to put COG in these sections, the prior crop and future crop sections. You'll also see that there are different perennial field crops, things like alfalfa, clover. For those of you that are working with pastures, there's pastures that are being rotationally grazed, pastures with improved grasses. So you've intentionally introduced new grass species in that pasture. or if you have pastures that are just native grass, so you've never replanted them, there's a code for that too. And then if you've got crops that, let me scroll down here. Oh, Amy, what did they do with my idle code? There it is. I found it.
Yep. Okay.
We're good. So I get this question a lot, which is why I wanted to take the time to point it out. If you have a field that's been fallow, so you haven't done anything with it intentionally, it's just kind of been sitting there, it's got some goldenrod, it's got a little bit of a marshy area, and you want to try to till it and plant it and grow something on it, there is a code that you can use called idle land, IDL. And essentially this means, you know what, we don't know what's been grown here. We don't know what type of, history, crop history it has. You can use this IDL code. And one advantage of going through your local cooperative extension office to put this form together is that they'll actually help you go through this step by step. So don't get intimidated. Always ask for help. And if you don't know where to go for that help, please feel free to reach out to Amy or I. So now we're going to look at, we'll come back to that slide, I promise. So I just wanted to show you what a commercial vegetable form looks like, so you can see how similar it is. So, oh, maybe not. We're just having all the tech issues tonight. There we go. Okay, so here's a commercial vegetable form. You'll see that it looks exactly the same. All of the categories that it is asking for are exactly the same, and all of the codes are exactly the same. So when I kind of skipped over the different lab testing methods, if you are working with a crop consultant who cares very passionately about what type of lab process or what chemistry process they're using, this is where you could use the two different forms. But for the most part, basically, we're going to use this form if we are growing commercial vegetable crops, but you'll see it's all exactly the same categories. And then for a fruit, hops, and Christmas tree form, there's one slight difference that we're going to take a look at. So for this form, you'll see that the top is all still the same, but when you get down here, you can select whether that's a surface or a subsurface sample. And if you draw a big circle around the two, so you have one surface sample and one subsurface sample, the lab will know to put those two together. So when it gives you your results, it'll be for that paired sampling. And then the last form that we're going to look at is a home garden form. And again, home garden form can be useful if you have a smaller market garden, because it will give you results that are going to be a little bit more fair to multiple species. With a home garden form, you'll see that it doesn't ask for that soil type that we're going to go through in just a second, but it does ask for plant name. If you've got mixed vegetables, you can just write down mixed vegetables. It'll ask you for what your perceived soil texture is of that garden, whether it's sandy, loamy, silty, or clay, how you feel that the drainage is, if it's excellent, good, fair, or poor, and if you want any supplemental services. The reason that it asks for these is that for the most part, our home gardens have improved soils. On these other forms, it asks for soil name. So how do you figure out what your soil name is? And the reason that it asks for soil name is that every type of soil all across the world has inherent properties. These inherent properties affect how the soil acts over time and what types of growing qualities it has or nutrient qualities that it has. So rather than making you watch a video for another 15 minutes, we have a really good video, 12 minutes and 38 seconds. We have a really good video about using a tool called the Web Soil Survey. The Web Soil Survey documents every single type of soil all across the country and maps it. So you actually go in and you put your address in, or what, the address of the field or the area that you want to look at. And it'll tell you what type of soil is in that area and what the inherent properties are of that soil. So when you go in and do your soil sample submission form, where it says soil name, you'll write down what that soil name is, but it's also just really cool to look through it and see what types of soil you're inherently working with on your field. So everyone will have this video, and we definitely encourage you all to watch it.
And Caitlin, do you mind if I interject super duper quick?
Yes, go ahead, please.
So something that I want to add is that when you're using the web soil survey to determine the soil type on your field, it's likely that there are going to be at least 2 different types of soils in that field. And that might be a little confusing. So which one do you put on your sample form? And the answer is, if you've split the field and tested by soil type, obviously put the split, what soil type each of the 2 are. And if it's one sample, one aggregate sample from one field, go ahead and pick whichever soil type dominates that field. That's all.
Perfect. Thank you, Amy. So after you send your sample in, it usually takes between 1 and 2 weeks. If it's during that busy season, this kind of spring rush, it does take a little bit longer than that. So just keep that in mind if you're planning on waiting to do any types of planning until you get that sample report back, that you're giving yourself enough time. So you send your sample in, you wait your 1 to 2 weeks, and you get an email from Agri1 that says, here's your soil sample report. What do you do with it? The easiest thing you can do with it is that if you listed a consultant on that form, you can call your consultant and say, hey, what does this mean? But we're going to kind of go through, these are the key things in the last few minutes that we have here. These are the key things that you want to look at. From the paperwork perspective, you want to make sure that you're filing your soil sample reports in a safe place and specifically designating what field it is. So back to my reference earlier about, like, if you've got multiple cornfields over time, it can be difficult to keep track of which field's which. The way that I actually do this is on that web soil survey that you'll watch the video on, I print out what field it is, kind of the aerial view of it, and attach it to that soil sample so that I know by photographic record which field that was. Once you get your results in, you'll read through and evaluate the recommendations, but a caveat that I always throw in is that these recommendations are a perfect world recommendation, and we're never going to get that, right? So we have to take these results, interpret them, and apply them to what's going to work for our farm. The most important things that we're going to look at right now are the pH and the lime recommendations. The reason for that is that most of the time, lime is what we want to do first because it has the biggest economic value. And then the fertilizer recommendations that these reports actually give are very specific, so it makes it really easy to follow those. So let's pull up a sample report. This is for a field crop. Let's get this here. And this is just a sample report that someone would get back after sending in their soil sample. So you'll see up here that it's got all of the identifying information. It's got the field location. This is what the farmer designated when they sent the sample in. The date sampled, date tested, so you can see what that gap looks like, the soil name or the predominant soil type. And if you had any other kind of description things listed on there. Then it goes through and shows you what your phosphorus and potassium levels were. These are the 2 things that we look at the most. It also shows you calcium and magnesium, which can be important if you've got some type of trace mineral issue happening with whatever crop you're growing. You'll see on this sample that potassium was a little bit high, phosphorus was a medium. The reason that we want to pay close attention to phosphorus and potassium is if they get up in this very high range, it can have environmental effects with things like runoff. So if we get the sample report back and our potassium and phosphorus are really high, then we should try to avoid applying phosphorus or potassium to that field or to that garden area. So then we're going to look at the soil pH. The soil pH for this was a 6. So pretty neutral, pretty good. And when we get down here, we'll see what the lime recommendations are. Definitely some room for improvement, right? So if most of our crops are optimized between 6.5 and 7.2, we've got a little bit of a way to go. It also shows other trace minerals, things like iron, manganese, zinc, aluminum, which those are important, again, depending on what crop you're growing and if you're experiencing any type of mineral deficiency or mineral-based disease. And then this other thing that it measures, which we've kind of alluded to, is organic matter. Organic matter actually provides nitrogen to that field inherently. It's built up over time by, growing things like legumes, the naturally occurring microbes, and all of the good beneficial bacteria help increase organic matter over time. The higher our organic matter is, the healthier our soil is. And the more kind of naturally occurring nitrogen it's going to provide to whatever crops we have growing. So this is a good organic matter actually for this soil. So we want to keep an eye on that. So down here, you're going to see where it has soil fertilizer recommendations. And this is kind of the biggest part that you want to look at when you get your sample report. So you'll see that it gives recommendations for lime. It's recommending 3.5 tons per acre. And then you'll see that it gives an N, P2O5, and K2O range. So that's the NPK fertilizer recommendations that Amy was talking about. And this gives it in pounds per acre. So 10 to 20 pounds of nitrogen, 25 pounds of phosphorus, and 0 pounds of potassium. It says 0 pounds of potassium, if you remember, because our potassium was really high. So the best thing that you can do is pretend that, pounds per acre, pretend that these are percentages of 100 pounds. So you need a 10, 25, 0 fertilizer and apply 100 pounds of that per acre, and you've got your fertilizer recommendations there. For the lime, it's a little bit more difficult to figure out. So this lime, we'll look down here. Lime rate is for 100% ENV. ENV is effective neutralizing value. This is a quality control measure. So when you purchase lime, you can purchase lime that's 100%, you can purchase lime that's 80%. And there's a little bit of math here that Amy and I can help walk you through. But if you're buying lime and applying lime that's an 80% ENV, you have to apply more than 3.5 tons to the acre to get the recommended amount of lime. So we're making an adjustment, a quality adjustment, based on this recommendation of 3.5 tons per acre of 100% ENV and whatever ENV we can get our hands on. So this is a sample of what the soil analysis report would look like, what types of information you can get from it. Dairy One does have other examples on their website. We'll share those links with you so that you have those. But in the interest of time, we have one more slide to go through and then we will stay on for questions. But if you have to hop off because we said we'd end at 7:30, please feel free to do that. So just kind of some last thoughts about economic considerations. Based on research, the biggest return on investment is one sample per 20 acres, which is why we say if you have 20 acres, do one sample. If you have 40 acres, do 2 samples. But as we talked about with Sarah's really great question earlier, there's definitely some farm level decisions that can be made to help change that. You might do one sample per 10 acres, or you might do one sample for 50 acres, depending on your situation. Another consideration is that based on research, the cost and economics, the cost of a sample around $20 will almost always pay for itself by either reducing the amount of fertilizer that you need to apply or increasing your yields. I know it can be really hard to justify that if you're sampling more than one field. So that's why Amy and I, pick the crops that are going to rely the most on an accurate soil sample report, but it will almost always pay for itself in the end. Another consideration is that, and I probably should have bolded this and highlighted it. So based on return on your value, kind of the maximum return on your value for lime applications is 3 tons per acre. So if you apply more than 3 tons per acre, the field cannot absorb and utilize and neutralize that pH in proportion to the extra lime that you added. So 3 tons per acre is kind of the peak return on the lime that we're applying. Sometimes we'll get soil sample reports like the one we just looked at that said 3.5 tons to the acre. In general, the best way to approach that is to apply 3 tons per acre in year 1. And then in year 2, apply 0.5 ton per acre. Or you could split it up even more. So you might apply 2 tons per acre in year 1 and 1.5 tons per acre in year 2. And the reason for that is just that economically speaking, if you apply more than 3 tons per lime per acre, you're not going to see a return on your investment. And then the final kind of economic consideration that I wanted to talk about is fertilizer value. So for those of you who have not had to buy fertilizer this year, fertilizer prices have more than doubled. So it makes it really difficult to justify applying the perfect amount of fertilizer depending on what type of crop you're growing, what type of yield you're expecting, and what the value of that crop is. So even though the soil sample might say, here's what you should apply for your fertilizer, there's some decisions and management changes that you could consider making when you have situations like we have this year where fertilizer costs are really, really high. Those depend on your crop. We've got tons of information on management techniques for field crops, but there's also some information out there for our vegetable and fruit producers as well. And then in everybody's slides that you're going to get, we've got tons of resources for you for follow-up information. We're going to, whoops, Amy, if you're able to drop that survey in the link. I'm not able to. We do have a Qualtrics survey that we would appreciate everybody filling out, and it'll also be in the follow-up information. And then just as a shameless plug, we still have 4 more webinars coming up about eggs, and these last 3 are all about raising goats. Okay, so let me go ahead and stop that. I'm going to share one more poll too while we're kind of wrapping everything up and taking a look at the questions that we've got here. And the poll question is, will you complete our follow-up survey? Your options are yes, Yelp, for sure, yes, and probably. So you'll notice that there's no. So we would really appreciate you guys sharing that or filling out that survey. Were you able to get that link at all, Amy?
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and pop that in the chat now.
Okay, thank you.
And Caitlin, just to confirm, that's the same one for all presentations.
Yep, same
right?
one for all. The first question when you get in there, it'll say, which workshop is this for?
Super.
And it should be set up to automatically pop up, but I've got some trust issues because sometimes it hasn't worked. So
we double check around here.
We do.
So
Okay.
we do have a couple of questions, if we could. So Rebecca asks, is there an a la carte menu for trace elements? We're thinking of getting sheep and want to know more about copper and selenium. So I will take the first part of that. So first, let me tell you that selenium is deficient in most soils in New York State and in the Northeast, simply because of changes that have happened in industrialization. We just don't have the selenium that we used to. So you're likely selenium deficient. In terms of copper, I don't know that Dairy 1 tests copper in soil, but there are other labs that do trace mineral testing that you could go through. One other shameless plug is that there is such thing as forage testing. So once that forage gets up and growing, you can go ahead and clip that forage and send it in for mineral analysis. I know that exists through Dairy 1. And the reason that you might want to consider this versus a soil test is that different plants absorb nutrients differently. And so even though you might have high copper in your soil, it might not translate into what the plant has taken up. So that would be my recommendation, is to go ahead and test the forage rather than the soil for copper and selenium. And then give your, well, that's veterinary advice. I'm not going to say that.
Good job,
Talk
Amy.
about BOSI. Look into injections of BOSI. All right.
Yeah, I was just double checking on the Dairy One lab website, and they don't have it listed as a standard test, but I'll tell you, their customer service at their lab in particular is absolutely amazing. So I've called them a couple of times with some specific stuff that I wanted tested, and they just made a note of it, told me how much it would be, and ran that test. But in that situation, definitely would just echo what Amy said. It's definitely better to focus on the forage that's coming off of those fields than the soil, just based on how that forage is going to take that up.
Yep. So Brian asks, is there a lime and fertilizer recommendation to be added before planting, or, oh, I see. Is the lime and fertilizer recommendation to be added before planting that year's crop, or is it a year ahead, or is it done during the season? Caitlin, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so it depends on the crop. In general, for field crops and vegetables, if you're going to run your sample and that like this year line, you put down what crop you're planting, your year one recommendations are before you plant it, right? So right before you plant it, same in season. The exception to that though is anything that is going to be a long-term crop that requires a lot of adjustments. So an example would be blueberries. Blueberries, what's the pH requirement? 5, right?
4.5 or 5. Yeah.
4.5 to 5. So if you have a field that the pH comes back and it's a 6, that can sometimes be a 2-year process to get enough sulfur applied to bring that pH low enough where it's going to be good for blueberries. But you don't want to skip that, because if you do, you're going to plant blueberries there and they're not going to produce as many berries as they should. For something that's an annual crop, so corn, for example, for the most part, you can plant corn in the ground and it's going to grow. So
just depends on how well it grows.
Right. So as long as your soil is pretty close, you can make those amendments that year and you'll be okay. But this brings up a really good question, or a really good point, that Amy and I are pro sampling in the fall, and this is why. So if you take your samples in the fall and you get a field back that's like, it's really bad, right? It's going to take 6 tons of lime for you to plant corn there. You have some time to readjust where that corn that you need to plant gets planted. You have some time to put lime on, and it has a little bit of time to work into the soil. So fall sampling can be helpful to give you more time and space to make decisions that don't have to be made today. However, it's not a perfect world. We can't always sample in the fall. So for most of those recommendations, it is you're sampling in the spring, and that year one recommendation is what you're going to do before or during the season.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. And then we have somebody who made a comment. So this person has the opinion that adapting organic and no-till practices can save money on fertilizers. And that's true. So especially if you employ strategic use of cover crops, and you allow the dead roots of those cover crops to naturally incorporate within the soil profile, you can get most of your nitrogen that way, especially if it's a cover crop that's leguminous, like maybe red clover, for instance. So yeah, there's some money to be saved if you go that method, but there are certainly challenges associated with no-till, as there are with till. So it's all a pros and cons list that we have to balance.
Yeah, and from a money perspective, because I'm the dream crusher here, right? From a money perspective, depending on your management goals and your business goals, you can actually save money either way. So depending on what you're growing and what your goals are, one type of farming might work better than another. But we're also seeing a lot of farms kind of meeting someplace in the middle. So conventional farms that, might have moldboard plowed everything every year, planted corn on the same land for 20 years in a row. We're starting to see them, using crop rotations and using cover crops and using some more traditional methods. Mm-hmm. But then also for folks that are organic and no-till, there's definitely some benefits to, tilling or incorporating in some type of low impact tillage. So in general, both of those methods, depending from an economic standpoint, it really depends on your management style, and a mix of both is, we're starting to see more and more of that. But if you can improve that soil health, you're going to decrease your fertilizer costs.
For sure. So Sarah asks, could you or would you send in a compost or manure sample to be tested? And I love this question because yes,
Sure
yes,
would.
yes. So we know that chemical or synthetic fertilizers have specific nutrition values per ton. We don't know that for manure. There can be huge variation in compost, especially there can be huge variation. So yes, Dairy One and other labs across the state do compost and manure testing. Look on their website or contact one of us to get some information on how to do that, but we can ship you information to point you in the right direction.
And there's also something too that we should add that in general, you can have a manure sample that tests the same as fertilizer. And when you go and apply them, the manure will do better than the fertilizer will. So there's just something inherently special about manure and compost and other types of organic fertilizers that we can use. So if you can get access to those, great. But it's really hard to guess what that nutrient value would be without testing it. So we definitely encourage testing that when you're able to.
Yep. And so Robert's following up on his comment earlier about no-till, and this is wonderful. So yeah. I love conversation. So you think that you can increase your soil health while still tilling. Can you expand on that and provide some resources? So one of the examples that I like to use is Michigan. So the state of Michigan has employed a no-till policy on all their farms. So for the past 25 years, Michigan was no-till. Well, they ended up experiencing issues where they had severe phosphorus and potassium runoff because those nutrients don't permeate the soil profile. They have to be tilled under. So for that reason, tilling reduced the environmental impact of the farming in that region. Though that said, and these are just like two things that I'm mentioning, there are so many other facets to this conversation, but tilling there is research that shows that tilling, especially repeated tilling, can destroy soil structures. But if you incorporate organic matter into the soil, like manure with bedding material in it, you can help increase some of these, some of the characteristics of that soil profile, making it better than it was before. It depends on where it started and where your goals are. And I'd love to have this conversation with you in more detail.
It's a really good question. And I think that we're starting to see more and more research coming out on the topic as we're all looking to improve soil health, right? So we know that soil health is, if that's improved, it improves our farming practices, it helps protect the environment, and it improves the profitability on those fields. So we know, we've seen some farms, and research has shown too that if you are a traditional farm that plows every year, tills every year, planting a cover crop in between, you can increase your soil health. Having a really good crop rotation schedule, you can increase your soil health. So even if you are a farm that's conventionally tilling, there's some things that you can do to improve that soil health, even though you're working that soil every single year. And if you're no-till, there's some things that you can do to improve that soil health with some type of minimal tillage occasionally too. But we've got a really good website, that Lime fact sheet that I shared with you. They've got, I think they're up to like 150 fact sheets right now, and there's some that are specifically on this topic of soil health when you're using conventional tillage or no-till practices. So we'll make sure we'll share those as like a research-based resource for everybody too.
Yep.
Oh, I'm just reading Robert's really good comment about soil structure. Yeah, Robert, we definitely, it's a really interesting topic that I'm excited to see more research coming out about. So we would love to have further conversation with this too. Sarah says light or low tilling seems to be more common from what I've been reading. Yep. To help with aeration, absolutely. Helps, like Amy was saying, depending on what type of fertility plan you have for that soil, can help incorporate those too. And I'll also say too, if you have a field that's really far off on pH, so you get a sample report back that says, you have a 5 and you don't want to be a blueberry crop farmer, tillage can help incorporate that line too, to more efficiently and more quickly bring that pH up to where it needs to be, so you're not wasting nutrients on that field.
And similarly, in market garden scenarios where they have permanent no-till raised beds, a lot of times in between crops, their fertilizer is compost or rotted manure. And so remember how we talked about how you apply it to the soil surface and sometimes it doesn't make its way in. The light tilling where they use the till forks to just rotate back and forth and just create air holes to move that organic matter into the soil profile is helpful for some.
Yeah. Worms help with aeration, absolutely.
Yeah, they do.
I'm out in Chautauqua County, so we're grape country, and we've actually got some farmers that are using what are they called? The radishes. What am I trying to say?
Yeah. Daikon
Yeah.
radishes?
Yes, yes.
Daikon, like the really long
Yes.
rooted radishes.
They're very long, right? And so you kind of plant them as a cover crop almost, and then in the spring, they're not there anymore because they've rotted away, but they've left some really helpful holes in the field to help improve aeration. So it's really great. And this conversation of like soil sampling definitely goes down the trail of soil management and how do we make sure we're getting the best soil health that we can using the practice that makes the most sense for our farm and for our goals.
So yeah, Sarah asks, I know it was lightly talked about tissue sampling. Any chance you could talk a little more about it or how often it should be done? That is a very long topic. I don't know, Caitlin, if you have like a 30-second overview, but that's one of those things where we'll have you reach out to us directly and we can provide you more information on that.
Yeah, and it really depends on what you're tissue sampling for.
Right.
So if you're tissue sampling for disease management and disease control or identification, like that's going to be a different process than tissue sampling for forage analysis,
right,
to see what we have. Or tissue sampling for nitrogen on our corn crops to see how much nitrogen we need to apply mid-season. So tissue sampling can be really helpful. Depending on the situation, soil sampling can be more helpful, and depending on the situation, soil sampling can be less helpful. So it would depend on what you're doing. And as far as like how often, again, it's going to go back to what's the purpose of tissue sampling. So if you are looking at forages that you're feeding to animals, best case scenario, you're sampling every batch or at least sampling, majority of your batches. If you're sampling because you want to see how selenium deficient your fields are, then you might be able to do that sample once and you're going to know that it's super deficient and talk to your vet about how to manage that. So as far as like the process for tissue sampling, it's the same idea where we're trying to get an aggregate sample. So we're not just going to walk out and grab one blade of grass and that's what we're going to tissue sample. We're going to get multiple different samples depending on the crop from across the field, aggregate those together, and then that's what goes into the lab. And you'll get a similar report too, where it says, these are the nutrients, the energy value, depending on if it's a forage sample. So similar process done through Dairy One for the most part in New York State, but there's definitely other labs available too. And it really just depends on like farm level, what you're looking to do. I probably went over my 30 seconds, but that's my minute and a half overview of tissue sampling. All right, well, I think that we will call it. So this was really good conversations about soil health and tilling and no-till. So I really appreciate you, Robert, because I know my wheels are turning and Amy's probably are too about like, that's another workshop topic, right? Like, so thank you for bringing that up. And thank you all for your good questions and participation. We're going to send out this recording and tons of resources and definitely reach out to Amy or I with any questions. And if you're not in our region, you can still reach out to us and we'll either help you troubleshoot them or find somebody that's closer to you. So any last words, Amy?
I echo everything Caitlin said. Thank you all. Your participation just makes these so much fun for us. It just livens everything up and makes it so much fun. So thank you so much. We're looking forward to our other webinars with you all, and we'll send out more information about those as they come available. So thanks again. Best of luck this planting season, and we'll see you next time.
Have a good night, folks.